The winter ball at Ashmore Park had been burning for 2 hours when the woman in the plain gray traveling cloak appeared at the ballroom doors. She did not announce herself to the footman. She did not surrender her cloak at the vestibule. She walked through the gilded arch of the doorway as if she were returning to a room she had left only minutes ago, and the candles in their 100 sockets seemed, for a single unsteady moment, to lean toward her. The orchestra finished its phrase. The couples on the floor slowed. The dowager, seated at the head of the room on a chair that might as well have been a throne, felt the air change and lifted her eyes. And at the center of the floor, in ice-blue silk and Ashmore diamonds that had not, until 5 years ago, belonged to her, Lady Cecily Frome turned. The room went quiet in the way that rooms go quiet when they understand, before they understand that something irrevocable is about to occur. The woman in the gray cloak looked at Cecily for a long moment. Her chin was level. Her hands, bare of gloves, were still at her sides. "I am the Duchess of Ashmore," she said, and her voice carried to every corner of that silent room without being raised. "I am the woman you buried, and I am here to take back what is mine." The ivory fan in Cecily's hand fell to the marble floor. It landed with a sound like a single struck note, small and clear, and in the ringing silence that followed it, no one in the room moved at all. No one except the Duke of Ashmore, who had been standing at the far end of the ballroom with his back to the door, and who turned. His face, in that moment, was not shown. What the candles showed instead was the rigid set of his shoulders, the way his hand tightened at his side, and the slow, arrested stillness of a man who has heard something that cannot be unhappened. You would understand later why his face mattered so much. For now, only the dropped fan, the gray cloak, and the words that still hung in the air between them like smoke. She had not planned to say it that way. She had rehearsed across the long miles of the journey north, something measured and procedural, something a solicitor might have advised. She had meant to present herself quietly, to speak with Mr. Cartwell before any public assembly, to avoid exactly this kind of scene. But she had heard, as she stood in the vestibule, the name of the school. She had heard one of the guests, a woman in rose-colored satin, say to her companion that the new Duchess intended to dissolve the Ashmore Endowment for Tenants' Education, that the little schoolhouse on the south grounds was to be sold for the building materials alone, that it was a sentimental indulgence of the late Duke's first wife and hardly befitting the station Cecily now occupied. Eleanor had promised her husband, standing at his grave 3 years after his death, that the school would stand as long as she drew breath. She had walked through the ballroom doors. 5 years and 4 months earlier, Eleanor had been 22 years old, and the Duchess of Ashmore for 11 months. And she had been traveling alone by night coach to her mother's house in Somerset, because her husband had, in a cold and measured voice, told her that her management of his household was not what he had imagined, that her attention to the tenants embarrassed him before his peers, and that she would do well to spend some weeks reflecting on what it meant to carry his name. She had not wept on the coach. She was not by nature a woman who wept easily. She had sat very straight, her hands folded in her lap, and watched the winter fields pass in the dark. And she had thought with the precision that grief produces in organized minds that she would prove him wrong by the time she returned. The coach had gone over the bridge at Storthwick at 11:30 at night, and the ice was not visible in the dark, and the horses had screamed, and Eleanor had gone into the river. She did not know how long she was in the water. She knew only that she came to consciousness in a laborer's cottage near the village of Nettleford, some 12 miles downstream, with a broken left wrist and 2 broken ribs, and a woman named Agnes Hobson pressing a heated brick against her feet and telling her to stay still. Agnes had not known who she was. Eleanor, in the first days of fever, had not remembered enough of herself to say. By the time she remembered, fully and without distortion. She was well enough to understand the implications, and well enough to be afraid. She had no money, no documents, no proof of anything. Her wedding ring had been lost in the river. The coach had gone entirely under, and the driver with it, and there was no one alive who had witnessed her passage. She had sent a letter to Ashmore Park in the second week. It had not been answered. She had sent a second letter, care of Mr. Cartwell the solicitor, in the third week. There had been no reply. In the fifth week, a woman in the village had shown her the notice in the County Gazette. The Duchess of Ashmore, born Eleanor Vane, was declared dead, her body not recovered from the River Storth. The Duke of Ashmore was reported in deep mourning. Eleanor had sat with that notice for a long time. She had begun to understand, with the clarity that very cold water and very plain circumstances produce, that a dead woman has no legal standing, and that her word against a county gazette and a household of servants was, without the support of someone at Ashmore who chose to believe her, worth precisely nothing. She had considered attempting to travel to Ashmore and presenting herself at the gate. She had considered what it would mean to be turned away, or worse, to be received as a madwoman and delivered to a magistrate whose first recourse would be the dukedom's solicitor. She had stayed in Nettleford. She had learned to sew with the efficiency her mother had always hoped she would develop, and she had been paid a small wage for it. And she had lived in a single room above the dressmaker's shop, with a window that looked out over the market square, and a fire that was sometimes adequate and sometimes not. She had thought about Edmund every day with an ache she could not quite separate from anger. And she had thought about the school with something closer to purpose. And she had thought about the girls in the Ashmore schoolroom learning to read their letters in the winter mornings, and she had told herself that the school was the reason she was keeping herself together. And sometimes she had believed it. She had written to him twice more in the years that followed. Neither letter was answered. She could not know if they were received. What finally brought her north, after 5 years of waiting and small industry, was a letter that Agnes's daughter, now a kitchen maid at Ashmore Park, had passed to her through a traveling peddler who stopped at Nettleford on his autumn circuit. The letter was not addressed to Eleanor by name. Agnes's daughter did not know Eleanor's name. She had written to her mother about the school, and her mother had brought the letter to Eleanor because Eleanor was the only person in Nettleford who, when the subject of the Ashmore tenants came up, went very still in a particular way. The school was to be dissolved by Michaelmas. The woman who called herself the Duchess of Ashmore had said it was a relic of a sentimental past and no longer aligned with the dukedom's present dignity. Eleanor had folded the letter, placed it in her pocket, and begun to pack. She had traveled the 90 miles to Ashmore in stages, 3 days in coaches, and 1 night in an inn where she spent the last of her savings, arriving at the estate service entrance on a Thursday afternoon in December with a single cloth bag and the address of Mr. Cartwell's office, written on a card she had found among the papers her mother had forwarded to her years ago. She had not gone to the solicitor first. She had gone to the kitchen. Mrs. Hobbs, who had been the Ashmore housekeeper for 22 years and who had personally overseen Eleanor's introduction to the household 11 months after Eleanor's marriage, was standing at the long deal table trimming pastry when Eleanor walked through the kitchen door. Mrs. Hobbs looked up. Her pastry trimmer stopped. Her face went through several stages in the space of 2 seconds, each one more complete than the last. "Your Grace," she said very quietly. It was the first time Eleanor had heard those words addressed to her in 5 years. She had not known how much weight they carried until they landed. "Mrs. Hobbs," she said, "I'm going to need your help." She had stood in the kitchen for an hour, drinking tea that tasted the same as it had always tasted, while Mrs. Hobbs told her everything she needed to know. The woman who called herself the Duchess, whose name was Cecily Frome, had arrived at Ashmore within weeks of Eleanor's disappearance as a companion to the Dowager. She had a distant connection to the family through the Dowager's late husband's sister's line, which was tenuous enough to mean very little, but which the Dowager had chosen to interpret as sufficient. She had produced documents that Mrs. Hobbs could not speak to, not being a woman of legal training, but which had apparently satisfied certain parties. The Duke himself had never acknowledged her formally as anything other than his mother's guest. He had not, Mrs. Hobbs said carefully, been himself in 5 years. He remained at Ashmore when he might have been in London, which was unlike him. He kept to his study. He did not attend the assemblies in the village. The household ran, Mrs. Hobbs said, as if it were waiting for something, though no one could have said for what. Eleanor had asked about the school. Mrs. Hobbs's mouth had gone tight. The school, she said, was still open. Just. But Cecily had presented the Duke with papers to sign last week, authorizing its dissolution, and he had not signed them yet, but everyone expected that he would before the new year. It was when Mrs. Hobbs said that Edmund had not signed them yet that Eleanor had felt something in her chest that was not quite hope and not quite certainty, but was adjacent to both. She had asked where the Duke was to be found. Mrs. Hobbs had told her about the winter ball. Eleanor had changed her dress, pressing the better of her 2 gowns as flat as she could manage, and had gone upstairs. She had seen him first from the upper landing, looking down through the carved balustrade at the guests assembling below. He was standing at the far end of the entrance hall in a dark coat, speaking to his steward, and her first sight of him after 5 years was of his profile against the warm light from the drawing-room door, and the sight of him stopped her breath the way the river water had stopped it. He was thinner than she remembered. The set of his jaw was harder. He had the look of a man who had spent 5 years being very correct and very contained, and who had paid for it in ways that were visible only in the particular stillness he held while the people around him moved. She watched him for long enough that she had to remind herself why she was there. She had not expected the familiarity of him to land so precisely. She had thought 5 years would dull it, the specific economy of his movements, the way he listened to his steward with his full attention, none of the distracted performance that other men of his rank offered in such conversations. She had thought distance and time and the river would have remade him into a stranger. They had not. He was altered, yes, and the alteration was painful to witness, but he was still entirely himself. And that was, if she was honest, the harder fact to absorb. She pressed her palm flat against the balustrade and made herself look away. She had come for the school. She would attend to the school. The rest could wait until the rest had a right to be addressed. She went to find her bag and to change her dress and to gather, from the particular calm that cold river water had given her years ago, whatever she was going to need to walk back into that room. He had not seen her. Cecily had. Cecily was crossing the hall below when she looked up and found Eleanor at the balustrade, and her eyes went very still in the way that calculated people's eyes go still when they are rapidly measuring a threat. She had mounted the stairs with unhurried elegance and stopped 3 steps below Eleanor, which placed them at equal eye level with perfect precision. "I do not believe we have been introduced," Cecily said. She had a pleasant voice. She knew how to use it. "I do not believe you would wish to have been," Eleanor said. Cecily's pleasant expression did not change. "You have the look of a woman who believes she has some purpose here," she said. "I would advise you to consider carefully before you act on that belief. This is the Duke of Ashmore's house, and his household is very well ordered." "I know whose house it is," Eleanor said. "I lived in it." Cecily studied her for another moment. Her eyes moved over the plain dress, the simple arrangement of Eleanor's hair, the cloth bag that Eleanor had set down at the foot of the balustrade. "A deluded village woman," Cecily said, and her voice was gentle with contempt, pitched low enough that only Eleanor could hear it. "Will find very little welcome at Ashmore Park and very little patience from its legal mistress. I suggest you take your bag and your claims and return to wherever it is you have come from." Eleanor held her gaze. "I will be in the ballroom," she said, "when you are ready." What she had not anticipated, walking into the ballroom an hour later, was that the school would come up in the first conversation she overheard. She had not planned the timing or the words. Some things arranged themselves beyond planning. She stood now in a ballroom that had gone absolutely silent, the dropped fan lying open on the marble between her and Cecily, and she was aware of every person in the room with the specific awareness of a woman who has spent 5 years learning to read a room from the lowest available vantage. Cecily recovered before most people would have. She was, Eleanor granted her, composed under pressure. She straightened, smoothed her ice-blue skirt with one gloved hand, and turned to address the nearest cluster of guests, which happened to include 3 baronets, 2 viscountesses, and a senior peer whose opinion in the county was considered nearly final. "I apologize for the interruption," Cecily said, and her voice was warm and genuinely amused. "It appears we have had a visitor. A deluded village woman, I am sorry to say, who has been making this kind of claim for some weeks, and who has been gently but firmly discouraged on each occasion." She smiled. "The poor creature is clearly unwell. I should not wish to embarrass her further by pressing the matter tonight." There was a murmur. Not entirely in Cecily's favor. Eleanor noted it. "I am not unwell," Eleanor said. She addressed herself to the room rather than to Cecily, and she spoke at the same even pitch she had used at the doorway. "I am Eleanor Vane, who became Eleanor Ashmore on the 14th of January, 1814, in the Church of St. Michael at Stourfield. I was declared dead following a carriage accident on the Storthwick Road in December of that same year. I was not dead. I am standing before you now, and I have returned to this house because there is a school on the south grounds that I promised my husband I would protect, and it appears that promise requires my physical presence." The dowager spoke from her chair at the head of the room. "Edmund," she said without raising her voice, "I think this matter requires your attention." Edmund had not moved from his position at the far end of the room. He had stood entirely still since he had turned, and Eleanor could feel the quality of his attention across the full length of the ballroom floor in the same way she had always felt it, even when she had believed it to be criticism. She had not been wrong about him. She had only been wrong about what his attention meant. He walked toward her now. The crowd parted without being asked. He stopped at a distance of 8 feet. His face was controlled in the way it was always controlled, which Eleanor had spent 11 months learning to read and 5 years remembering. She read it now. He looked at her for a long time. "My lord," she said. "I require a moment," he said, to the room in general, and his voice was the level and quiet that she remembered from his kindest moments, the voice that was not cold, but only contained. He did not take his eyes from her face. "My mother," he said then, still looking at Eleanor. "You will excuse us." "Edmund." His mother's voice carried a note of warning. He did not look away from Eleanor. "A moment," he said again. The dowager rose. She came to Edmund with the unhurried authority of a woman who had managed this family for 40 years, and she spoke to him in a low voice that was not quite private, as it was not intended to be. "This woman has no documents and no witnesses," she said. She has the look and the manner of a person who has perhaps convinced herself of something. She cannot prove a word she says. To entertain this claim in front of the county is to expose yourself to ridicule and the dukedom to legal confusion. I would ask you, for the sake of the family, to have her removed quietly." Edmund was quiet for a moment. "What she says about the carriage accident," he said. "Is it accurate?" His mother paused. "It is public knowledge. Anyone might have obtained it. She named the church and the date of our marriage. Also public knowledge for those who wish to look." Edmund said nothing. "Edmund?" His mother's voice lost some of its certainty, which it did rarely. "She is a nobody, claiming what she cannot prove. Whatever she has told herself, whatever story has sustained her, she is not. She cannot be. What this woman claims." Eleanor heard those words through the marble floor beneath her feet and through the still air of the ballroom, and did not look away from Edmund's face. He looked at her. She understood, in that moment, what it had cost him. She saw it in the set of his jaw and in the steadiness with which he held himself. The steadiness of a man who has made himself hold very still for 5 years because movement would have destroyed him. She understood what the last words he had spoken to her had done to him in her absence, and she forgave him for them in the same instant she understood them, completely and without reservation, because the alternative was a waste of the time that remained to them. She turned away from him and walked to the ballroom doors. She heard his mother say behind her, "You see, there is nothing there." The corridor outside the ballroom was cold after the warmth of the candles, and Eleanor stood in it for a moment with her hand pressed flat against the wall beside the door, feeling the music restart inside the room. A waltz. Something courtly and restoring. She could hear the guests beginning to speak again. The first hesitant exchanges of people who needed to process what had just occurred and had decided to do so over wine. She had not brought anything with her except the card with Mr. Cartwell's address and the letter from Agnes's daughter. She would go to Mr. Cartwell in the morning. She would pursue this through the proper channels, which was what she should have done first. And she would protect the school through legal means if social ones were to be denied her. She had come back for the school. She had always told herself that was why she had come back. Standing in the cold corridor with the waltz playing on the other side of the door, she permitted herself, for the first time, to know that it was not entirely true. The door opened. Edmund stepped into the corridor. He pulled the door closed behind him. In the narrower light of the passage, without the assembled county watching, his face was different. The controlled surface had not dropped, but something beneath it was visible in the way that deep water is visible through ice. He said nothing for a moment. "What color were my wife's eyes?" he said. Eleanor looked at him. "Gray," she said. "The left one carried a small amber ring at the inner edge. You noticed it on the evening of our second meeting and did not mention it for 6 weeks, until a night in March when you told me that it was the detail that had first convinced you she was not as ordinary as she appeared." He was very still. "She had a scar," he said carefully, "on her right palm, from a childhood fall." She turned her right hand up and held it toward the candle in the bracket beside the door. Edmund looked at the scar for a long moment. When he looked up at her face, his expression was no longer controlled in quite the way it had been. "I sent 3 letters," she said. "In the first year. I received none. I thought as much." She lowered her hand. "I should have come sooner. I thought my word against a county gazette and a household of witnesses would be worth nothing. I thought I would need proof before I could afford to be disbelieved." "Eleanor," he said. It was the first time in 5 years that anyone had said her name in that voice, with that specific quality of careful weight. It landed like a hand at her shoulder. "I was not going to tell you this tonight," she said. "I was going to speak with Mr. Cartwell first. I lost my nerve in the vestibule, or found it, depending on one's view. What changed? What made you come back now, after 5 years?" She told him about the school. She told him quietly and without ornament, and she watched him listen. And she saw in his face, as she spoke, the thing she had not been certain she would see. He had not signed Cecily's papers. He had not signed them, and he had not known clearly why. And now he did. "Come back inside," he said. "I have not been welcomed inside." "Come back inside," he said again. And his voice was the voice she recognized from 100 small occasions in the 11 months of their marriage. The voice that was a command and a protection at the same time. And she felt its old effect on her, the way one feels a familiar temperature. She went back inside. The room was slower to settle than it had been when she had left it. A waltz was ending. Cecily, at the room's center, was speaking to the senior peer with her hand at his arm and her most composed expression arranged on her face. The dowager sat where she had sat before. Neither of them had expected Eleanor to return. Edmund walked ahead of her. He did not look to the sides. He crossed the room in the way she had always admired in him, with the unhurried authority of a man who did not require the room's attention, but understood it was his, if he chose to claim it. He stopped in the center of the floor. He reached into his breast pocket. What he withdrew was very small, and very worn from handling. And the candlelight caught the painted surface of it with the particular warmth of a thing that has been taken out, and looked at, and put away again many times across a long span of years. It was a miniature portrait. Eleanor knew it without needing to see the face. She had sat for it in the spring of their first year. It was the year before his father died. Edmund had commissioned it from a painter in Bath, a small portrait of uncommon precision. And he had paid more for it than she had thought it warranted. And she had told him so. And he had said only that he wished to have something of her that he could carry. He had carried it for 5 years. She could see, from the distance of a few feet, how worn the case was. He held it out to the room. The senior peer leaned forward. One of the viscountesses stood from her chair. "This portrait," Edmund said, and his voice was the quiet that carries, "was painted in the spring of 1814. I am asking anyone present to look at the woman who has come to this room tonight, and to look at this portrait, and to tell me that they are not the same woman." Cecily stepped forward. Her face was still pleasant. "Edmund, this is unnecessary. The resemblance may be general, but any number of women in the county might have dark hair and a pale complexion. This proves nothing." The door of the ballroom opened. Mr. Cartwell, who was the Ashmore solicitor, and who had, by some arrangement Eleanor could not account for, been present at the hall this evening, came through it. He was a man of 60, precise and unhurried, with the particular composure of a person who has spent a professional lifetime managing the consequences of other people's decisions. "Your Grace," he said, and addressed himself to Edmund, and then paused and looked at Eleanor. His expression changed. He had drawn Eleanor's marriage settlement. He had been present at the church. He knew her face as well as he knew any document he had ever witnessed. "Mrs. Cartwell mentioned to me," he said very carefully, "that there was a lady at the door of the hall this evening who gave the footman some trouble. I did not expect to see her here." He stopped. He began again. "Forgive me, Your Grace," he said, and this time he addressed Eleanor. Are you quite well? Better than I have been, she said. In some time. He reached into his own coat. He had papers. He had the marriage documents, which he had apparently thought to bring when his wife had passed on what she had seen in the vestibule. And he unfolded them now in the warm candlelight, with the air of a man who understands that the time for delay has concluded. The room watched. Cecily watched. Her fan was still on the floor where she had dropped it. Someone had moved it to the edge of the marble in the last few minutes, out of the way of the dancing that had never quite resumed. It lay there, ivory and still. The original documents, Mr. Cartwell said to Edmund, bear the signatures of both parties. The portrait miniature was noted in the settlement inventory at the Duke's request. He looked at Eleanor again, with the precision of a man completing a calculation. Your Grace, he said, and he was not confused about which Duchess he was addressing. I believe we have a considerable amount of legal work to complete. When you are ready. Edmund looked at the room. This woman is my wife, he said. Eleanor is my wife. She has always been my wife. 10 words, quiet and level, and without any of the theatrical weight that a lesser man might have been tempted to apply. Simply true, spoken plainly, in the same arena where it had been denied. The silence that followed was of a different order than the silence that had greeted Eleanor's arrival. In the first silence, the room had not known what it was witnessing. In this one, it knew. Cecily's face was doing something it had likely never been required to do in 40 years of accomplished social management. The arrangement of her features, which had been so perfectly calibrated for so long, was not quite holding. She looked at Edmund. She looked at Mr. Cartwell's papers. She looked at the miniature portrait, which was being passed now from hand to hand among the viscountesses, who were murmuring to one another with a particular quality of astonishment. You cannot, Cecily said. Her voice was still pleasant. She was fighting to keep it so. You cannot simply do this. 5 years, Edmund. 5 years of documented history. Fraudulent documentation, Mr. Cartwell said, and his voice was gently informative, is a matter for the courts, and not, I think, for this evening. Cecily looked at the Dowager. The Dowager was looking at Eleanor. She had not looked at Eleanor that directly before, not since Eleanor had entered the room. She looked now with the focused attention of a woman who had spent 40 years studying the faces of people brought into her family's orbit, and who had looked at Eleanor's face on the night of Eleanor's arrival at Ashmore as a new bride, and had found it insufficient, and who was now looking at it again across 5 years of absence. Eleanor stood still and let herself be looked at. The Dowager said nothing for a long moment. Then she said, to no one in particular, she has the same habit of her hands. I had forgotten. Her voice had lost its certainty. It had not lost its dignity. Edmund, she said. Yes, he said. I owe this woman a considerable accounting. Yes, he said again. You do. The Dowager was quiet. She folded her hands in her lap, and she looked at the floor of the ballroom, and she did not speak again. Cecily, who had no patron left and no social architecture to retreat into, looked once more at Edmund, who did not look at her, and then she gathered her ice-blue skirts and walked, with the only elegance available to her, from the room. She did not recover her fan. The room exhaled. If you have stayed with this story through the cold corridor and the long years of waiting, leave a word below. Eleanor earned every moment of this, and so did you. The guests, to their credit, recovered as the county always recovers, with practical warmth and an instinct that the correct response was to behave as if nothing untoward had occurred, while simultaneously ensuring that everyone present understood exactly what they had witnessed. The senior peer shook Edmund's hand. The Viscountesses surrounded Eleanor with the solicitous efficiency of women who have waited their whole lives for a scene of this precise kind. Mr. Cartwell retreated to a corner with his papers and a glass of claret, and the expression of a man who has just resolved a situation he has been quietly worrying about for 5 years. The ball went on until midnight, as it had been scheduled to do. Eleanor did not dance. She stood at the edge of the room and watched the restored order of it, the way the candles caught the movement and the color and the glint of jewels. And she thought, not for the first time, that Ashmore was a very beautiful house. She had thought so on the night she first came to it as a bride. She had tried, during her 11 months in it, to learn to feel that it was hers. She was not certain she had succeeded before she left. She thought she might do better this time. Edmund stood beside her for most of the evening without speaking. This, too, was familiar. He had always been a man who was more present in silence than most men were in speech. She had found it difficult in the early months of their marriage. She had learned, toward the end of those months, to receive it as it was intended. She stood beside him now and felt the warmth of his proximity in the cold-edged room and understood that he was doing it on purpose, that the shoulder nearly touching hers was a deliberate thing, and she felt its old effect on her as something both new and entirely recognizable. The last guests departed after midnight. The house staff moved through the rooms with the practiced efficiency of people returning a space to its natural order. Mrs. Hobbs, passing through the ballroom with a pair of footmen, caught Eleanor's eye across the emptying room and inclined her head with the contained satisfaction of a woman who has been keeping a specific faith for 5 years and has now been vindicated. Edmund dismissed the remaining staff at 1 in the morning. They sat in the library, where the fire had been built up against the December cold, on opposite sides of the hearth. Eleanor had a cup of tea that she was not drinking. Edmund had a glass of brandy that he was also not drinking. The miniature portrait lay on the table between them, face up, the small painted Eleanor looking at the ceiling. "The school," Edmund said. "The school," she agreed. "I will have Cartwell confirm the endowment's terms as they stand," he said, "by the end of the week." "Thank you." He was quiet for a moment. The fire moved in the grate. Outside, somewhere in the distance, a window shutter that someone had failed to latch was knocking gently against the stone. "I wrote to you," he said. "In the first month. 3 letters. I sent 3 of my own." He looked at the fire. "Cecily was managing the household correspondence by the 2nd week," he said. "I was not in a state to notice what was passing through it." "I know," she said. "I think I knew, even then. I kept writing because I could not afford to stop." He said nothing for another moment. "The night you left," he began. "I know," she said again. "You do not need to." "I do need to," he said. "I have needed to for 5 years." He looked at her then, and the control was still there, but the surface of it was different. The way ice is different when the temperature is rising and the light comes through it. "I was wrong. What I said to you that night was both wrong and unkind, and if I had not sent you away, you would not have been on the road, and none of this would have happened. I have known that since the morning after you left, and I have had to live inside that knowledge for 5 years, and I would ask you to understand that there is not a version of your return, however difficult, that I would not have preferred to what I have endured in your absence." Eleanor set down her cup. "Edmund?" she said. "Yes." "You kept the miniature." He looked at the portrait on the table. "Yes." "You wore a path in the case from handling it." He said nothing. "That is," she said carefully, "a considerable statement of feeling for a man who told me my management of his household was not what he had imagined." Something moved across his face. It might have been, if one were watching from the right angle in the firelight, something almost like the expression a man makes when he has been carrying a very heavy thing for a very long time and has just been told he may put it down. "Yes," he said. "I suppose it is." She looked at him for a long moment. He looked back at her with the same quality of attention he had turned on her across the ballroom, and then with rather more than that, the attention that had no name for it except the one that the body provides. "I did not come back for the title," she said. "I came back for the school." "I know. But I find," she said, "that I am glad to be here." He reached across the table. He picked up the miniature portrait. He looked at it for a moment, the small painted face, and then he held it out to her. She took it. The case was warm from years of his hands, and she held it for a moment without looking at it, feeling that warmth, which was not the warmth of the fire or the warmth of the room, but something more particular than either. Edmund did not move from his chair. He was watching her in the way he had watched her from the far end of the ballroom, with a quality of attention that she was now willing to name correctly, and that she met, after a moment, without looking away. The fire settled in the grate. Outside, the December dark was absolute and silent, and somewhere on the south grounds, in a small building whose stone foundation had been laid with specific care, the Ashmore School waited for morning. Eleanor held the miniature in both hands, this small, worn portrait of the woman she had been, and was still, and she felt the warmth of it, and the warmth of the fire, and the warmth of the man sitting across from her who had carried this for 5 years. And she understood that she had come back to the right place. She had been buried. She had returned. The school would stand. That was enough. And it was everything.